Just look at these amazing miracles before you. These rock crystals, these energy beings, these stone people. How did they come into being? How did this happen? It's nothing short of a miracle. How do they have different colors and shapes and sizes? That's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to have a little science lesson to find out and answer all of those questions. Okay.
Okay.
So how does this all start, Tom?
Whoa.
How did this thing get created?
Where does it start? Where does it start? It starts in the void, where there's nothing, we don't know where it starts from, right? The great mystery is where it starts. But what we do know is that then there is energy. Energy, pure energy, is the baseline of the universe. That's where everything starts. And on the smallest particle of awareness that we're aware of, there's these little sparks of electricity, electromagnetic energy, and we call them quarks. And they're these they're all the same. They're the building blocks of life itself. And out of those building blocks, they start coming together and they start grouping together. And those little quarks form these other little teeny bit bigger things that are called protons and neutrons. And these are the core, these form the core of every single element and mineral that we are aware of throughout the entire universe. Everything is formed, every element, everything that exists is formed out of these little protons and neutrons, and they're little electrical charges. These positive protons have this positive charge, the neutrons have a neutral charge, and then there's these other little, even tinier little charges that just go round and round and round and form this cloud around the protons and neutrons, and we call those electrons. And together, they somehow hold together the electrons and the protons, and as they hold together, they form what we call atoms. And atoms are the smallest formed group of matter that we can be aware of, that we have some perception of. And so these atoms are all different, and they're only different because the number of the protons and the neutrons and the electrons. So the very first smallest atom that exists in the entire universe everywhere is what we call hydrogen, because it's just one proton and one electron all excited and spinning around it. So, and then everything else we know, from helium to carbon to oxygen to zinc to gold to uranium to all this there's 118 elements that are known, that they're all just different because they have different numbers of these protons, neutrons, and electrons, and that's all that differentiates them. So, but they have different properties and different qualities because of these different numbers. And then, once these atoms form, they start attracting each other, right? And these attractions, these atoms, they form in groups, and these groups are called molecules, and then the molecules attract other molecules, and they start forming clumps that we can begin to actually see in the world. And that's how things are formed.
And let me do a review on that. So, you've got those little quarks, right? Mm-hmm. And you've got three little quarks. Three quarks make up a
proton or neutron.
Okay. And then you've got the protons and neutrons, and those make up the nucleus. And then what's flying around there are these electrons that are sort of waves, not waves, but they're floating around.
They're in clouds. They can't really be tracked until you take a picture, and then you can spot them in that moment. But before you do that, they're just like...
Yeah. So that's what creates an atom, right? And so as Tom was saying, the numbers of neutrons, protons, and electrons are what give them a particular name.
Right.
And all of those atoms then, and by the way, those atoms, believe it or not, have this littlest, tiniest bit of mass to them. So there's weight there's weight in there, if you can believe that, one little tiny atom. So each of those atoms are on the periodic scale, right? And that's what you've seen.
Periodic table,
and you can see here. And so, as Thom had said, those are all creating something. That's like things becoming manifest or materialized in the world.
Right, and we're made up of all those atoms, all those molecules. That makes up us, our bodies too.
Exactly. So when you have one of those atoms and it meets another atom and they're like, hey, let's do something here together. When you have two or more atoms that come together, that's called a molecule. Do you feel really smart now? I do. It took me a long time to figure it out. That has more mass.
Yeah.
And the more and more and more and more those atoms come together and the molecules form, the bigger the mass is, until we can begin to see them.
Right, right. And so the way these begin to take shape, because of the number of protons and neutrons, it creates kind of a, they try to find the most comfortable way to be together. And not only the most comfortable, but the way that requires the least amount of energy to be together. So they fall into these patterns that these atoms begin to form with each other. And these patterns create the molecules, as we've said. And then these patterns continue to form again and again and again. And it's these repeating patterns that become the basis of crystals, of all the crystalline structure of every element that there is.
And those basic patterns become what we call sacred geometry, which we'll talk much more about in a later segment.
Absolutely.
So, we've got these protons, electrons, and neutrons, and they're all swimming around, and they're making this atom thing happen, and then an atom and another atom come together and they make a molecule. When those molecules keep building and building, we can start to see it with our eye, right? So anyway, we have these elements coming out of all this. So what happens next? How do these elements, what are elements, and how do they create stones and crystals we see today?
Well, there are some elements, as these things come together and they get bigger and bigger, we can actually see them with our eyes. And there are some elements that's all they are. They are one pure element, such as
copper.
Copper is one pure element.
Iron.
Iron, gold. These elements are there's just one atom that doesn't change, and it just builds and builds and builds, and they're all exactly the same. Copper, iron, silicon, aluminum, gold, all these metals that we're familiar with. There are other elements, but some are in gases, and some aren't metallic. But these basic elements form the world that we know. The next thing that happens is that sometimes these elements get attracted to each other and come together to form completely new particles of matter.
A whole brand new manifestation, a whole brand new miracle that's happening.
Right.
So, for example,
water. So water is the simplest example. You have one element, hydrogen, and another element, oxygen, and they attract each other, come together, and they form a completely new thing, water. And so this whole new substance is created with these two elements. And in that same way, other elements come together to form different crystals and different forms as we know it.
for example,
For example,
if you stick a silicon and
Oxygen.
you get
quartz, right? So quartz is one silicon atom and two oxygen atoms. And they are very happy together, and they stick together, and they exist throughout all of the world's crust. And we'll talk more about that next.
Right, so you have these one silicon and two oxygen that come together, and they form a quartz. But something tells me that there's a lot of something that has to happen in order for that to manifest itself.
So how does that happen, right? Well, they have to be in proximity with each other, and there's lots of environmental factors that go to work to help bring these two together in a way that they're going to bond and stick together. And so some of those environmental pressures we know are, there has to be heat, pressure, like a pressure cooker. There's other environmental forces, time, length of time that things are together and in proximity helps. So heat, pressure, time. And then there's other processes like precipitation, evaporation.
And cooling.
And cooling, right. All of those help to bring these different elements together to form new substances.